Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer White. I'm a product evangelist here at Madcap Software in gorgeous La Jolla, California. Thank you so much for joining us. ePUB formatting tips and tricks with the brilliant Robert Desprez. Now we're going to get on with the show in just a second, but first I want to let you know that we will be providing you with this slide deck and also a recording of this webinar, so keep an eye on your email after the webinar and we'll let you know how to get those items. Also, at the end of the webinar, we'll be providing you with a coupon code for $100 off of Madcap training. And this is going to come in handy because we have a brand new class we're debuting called Writing and Publishing for Mobile and ePUB. More details on that and that coupon code coming up after the webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to type them into the question box. I'll be keeping track of all of them as we go through the webinar. And then at the end, I'll be sharing the questions with Robert for a discussion at the very end of the webinar. So let me introduce you right now to your host today, Robert Desprez. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for joining me this morning on my session on formatting ePUB files. So I'll just tell you very briefly about myself. I've worked now about 15 years in technical communications. In years past, I was heavily involved in volunteering for the local chapter of the Society for Technical Communication here in Vancouver, British Columbia. That's where I live. And I've done a couple of variations of this talk. I did this talk earlier in the year at the Writers UA conference. Obviously, it wasn't a webinar. I was actually in person in Seattle. And more recently, I did a talk of this at the local chapter of the Canada West Coast chapter in Vancouver about formatting ePUBs. So just to get started, I wanted to touch on some of the things that we are, some of the rules here. If you're asking me questions and I'm not answering you, that's actually because I can't hear you. You're muted. We should be done within the hour. I found this talk typically takes 35, 40 minutes. I'll do my best to answer your questions at the end of the webinar. I think we've got at least 10 or 15 minutes to do that, and we are recording the session. So what I'm going to be talking about today, so I will be introducing ePUB files, why I think they're important for technical communicators. I'm going to be explaining the pros and cons of ePUBs. I'm actually going to open up an ePUB and change the cascading style sheet so you get a sense of how you can change some of the formatting. And then I'm going to be talking about some of the specifics about the changing of formatting, so specifically fonts, alignment of text, page breaks, widows and orphans in the CSS, how you can do that. And then I will be talking about the importance of validating and previewing files. And I did want to make a note that this webinar actually doesn't focus on tools, so I'm not going to be talking actually a lot about Madcap. What I'm actually going to be focusing on is opening up the ePUB file, changing the CSS, making changes to that content, and then showing you some of the things that you can do with that. Okay, so let's get started. So what's an ePUB file? Well, an ePUB is just simply a zip file with the ePUB extension. You can create ePUB files using a bunch of different tools, including good old Microsoft Word. There's Adobe InDesign, and then more recently, help authoring tools such as Madcap Flair and Adobe RoboHelp. They will also create ePUBs for you. So once the tool does that for you, then you need to read the ePUB on another piece of software called an e-reader. So there's lots of different e-reader packages out there. I'm going to be touching on some of the ones that you can commonly use. But suffice to say, all these different e-readers will let you read content on PCs, on iPads, iPhones, smartphones, you name it. There's an e-reader for it. Okay, so ePUBs. I thought I'd do a little history. ePUBs are, I think, going to be increasingly part of our future. When I started in technical communications way back in the 90s, we were using PDFs. People were creating HTML help, and at the company that I worked for, we were actually producing guides that were being commercially printed, and then they'd come back to us in boxes and they were being spiral bound. So it probably doesn't surprise you to hear that in the last 10 or 15 years, the idea of content being professionally printed, it seems in my world anyway, no one's doing that anymore. And people are increasingly going online. So in the last 10 years, with the shrinking budgets after the .com era, people were producing web help, Flash help, Eclipse help, and PDFs were there. And then more recently now, we have the popularity of smartphones and tablets. So we're finding that PCs are actually being overshadowed by these devices. And with that, we're finding there's more file formats that technical writers will probably need to deal with in the future. So there's the tried and true tri-pane help. But now there's also HTML5, which will run on tablets. There's the old PDFs, but along with that, there's going to be ePUB files. And I just think that because of the popularity of these mobile devices, that more and more people are just reading content online versus the printed. And I think sooner or later, technical communications is going to be part of that. And that as tech writers, we are probably going to start to need to produce more and more content using file formats like HTML5 and ePUB. So I think in the coming years, I envision that ePUB is going to be out there more. Okay, so let's talk about strengths of an ePUB. One of the nice things about ePUBs recently in the last few years is it's becoming increasingly easy to produce. So in the past, some of the help authoring tools claimed that they could generate ePUB, and they could, but what happened is you actually had to do some extra steps to prepare the files for final usage. So luckily, help authoring vendors such as MadCap and RoboHelp, they've made it a lot easier to do that. And so now I know with the recent versions of some of the software, you can just say, I want to generate it to an ePUB file, and actually you don't have to do any extra steps actually to view the content, as long as you have some e-reader software. Another nice thing about ePUB files is that they can be viewed offline. So once an ePUB file is transferred to a smartphone or a tablet, it can be read without an internet connection. So if your users have little or no internet connectivity, ePUB files may offer a great solution. It's the same idea as with an ebook. When you buy it from Amazon, you need an internet connection to download the file, but then you can go to your remote cabin or you can go in an airplane and happily read that file without any network connection. Same thing with an ePUB. Last thing that I wanted to mention on this slide anyway about strengths of an ePUB is that ePUBs can be delivered and are delivered through Apple's iBook store. And when you're downloading content from that store, it's not being done through PDF. It's actually being done through an ePUB file. So if you're ever thinking that you want to self-publish or you want to market something that you've done and you want to do it through Apple, ePUB file format is probably going to be the way to go. Another strength of the ePUB is its ability to reflow. So I just wanted to show you this. I took a screen capture of this file on an iPad on the left. So you can see it has the several paragraphs, it has an image. On the right-hand side, we have the same file, but it's being shown on an iPhone. And even though it's the same file, you can see that the presentation is different. And this sort of speaks to one of ePUB's key strengths is its ability to reflow based on the device you're using. If you compare that, or I guess contrast that with a PDF file, you can have a PDF file that looks amazing on your 24-inch monitor at home. And if you take that same file and you put it on your smartphone, it's not a pleasure to read. There's a lot of scrolling, a lot of zooming in, zooming out. It's difficult and it's not optimized for your smartphone, whereas ePUBs automatically will do that for you. So I think that's one of the big strengths of ePUBs right here. Okay, well, so I talked about some of the advantages. Of course, there are disadvantages of ePUBs, so I want to touch on a few of those. One of the things that ePUBs do really well is it's perfect for a book like a piece of fiction where you're reading chapter after chapter, such as Moby Dick. So people typically read books like that. They read one chapter, then they read the next chapter. It's linear. Well, as we all know, users of technical communication, I'd like to think that they were reading my content chapter after chapter after chapter. Sadly, they're not doing that. They're actually going from topic to topic and trying to get the answers that they need. So this is an issue because I find it can be a little easier to get lost in an EPUB file than some of our traditional file formats. I'm going to be talking about that and showing you a couple of examples of that later, but I wanted to touch on that. Another thing to mention about EPUB files is that there is an extra app that's required. So to view an ePUB file, your users are going to need to download and install e-reader software. So for instance, on the PC, there's Adobe Digital Editions, which is a free piece of software that you can download. For any of the iOS devices, there's iBooks. It's Apple's free e-reader. So it's not a huge deal to install it if you're fairly technically savvy and you know that where you have to go and install the thing. And then there's the issue of getting the EPUB file over onto the device. For people who live and breathe technology, that's not a big deal. But if your users are not very savvy, that could be a stumbling block. So it's something to think about. I was personally a bit surprised when I cracked open my iPad that iBooks wasn't pre-installed on there, and I actually had to go to Apple's App Store and download it. I thought it would be pre-installed, but it's not. So it's just little things like that, that if your users are not that up on technology, that could get them stuck. Okay, so disadvantages I mentioned about it's sometimes, I think, easier to get lost in an EPUB file than a traditional help system. This is a screen capture of a traditional help system where you have the table of contents on the left and you can expand it and close it. And typically, unless you specifically want to close this table of contents on the left, it always is there. So as you navigate, it'll show you in the left where you are in the hierarchy, and it gives some reassurance of where you are in this whole table of contents. Well, if you contrast that now with a EPUB file, you have the table of contents on the right-hand side. But like a book, a traditional printed book, once you turn the page, the table of contents is gone. So you don't have that reassurance of, showing you where you are. And I think for a bigger EPUB, and if you've got a lot of content, losing the table of contents could be a stumbling block for some people because they don't know where they are in the structure. So that's one change between the old deliverables and the new. The other thing I wanted to mention before I move on is that the formatting of EPUB files sometimes can not be consistent across different e-readers. So what I've noticed is I've presented or put together some content that might show up nicely on iBooks, and I take that same file and I put it over into the Adobe Digital Editions, and maybe the font is different, or maybe the alignment is different. So that's actually what sort of got me started on this presentation was, well, why is there different content on different devices? So the reason that I started on this talk and this research was I was trying to figure out, well, how do you mitigate those changes across different e-reader packages? And so that's what I'm going to share with you a little bit later in the talk. Okay, so I mentioned that there's different e-reader packages out there. So here's a partial list of some of the more popular ones. If you Google ePUB e-readers for Android, there are many different types of e-reader packages out there. For iPhone and iPad, iOS, there's iBooks, which I mentioned. You can, if you want, there's an emulator for Barnes & Noble Nook, so you can try it out on your PC if you want. There's the free Adobe Digital Editions that you can try on your PC. The one rogue exception is Amazon, and so they're not using ePUB, they're using another file format called Mobi. And so I know some of the newer help authoring tools also permit you to create content, and it can go into a Mobi file format too. So it has both bases covered there. All right. So there's really two ways to revise an ePUB file. The first way, the path on the left, if you choose to take it, is through the help authoring tool. And I think that's actually an awesome way to get started because it will have, it will generate your cover, it will generate your table of contents, of course it will generate the material inside. So if you want to leverage that, I would actually highly recommend you do that. Now what you can do after the fact is once you've generated your content from a help authoring tool, you can go inside the ePUB that it's generated, open it up, go into the CSS, your cascading style sheet, and modify it. And it gives you some more control over things that a normal help authoring tool wouldn't provide you. So I'm going to be really talking about route number 2 here. I'm not going to be dwelling on how to generate content from Madcap or Robo Help here. What I'm going to be showing you is after the fact, how you go into the CSS and how you can change some things inside there. Another thing that I thought maybe was worth mentioning, my experience is that ePUBs are sort of, they're out there and they've been out there for a while, but a lot of tech writers are not really using the content that much in their jobs. So I thought this was a worthwhile slide, just in that if you start at the top and you're creating an ePUB file, the whole model of generating and regenerating content is just very much the same way as if you created online help. You create the ePUB file, you generate it, you view it in an e-reader software, you look at the content, you probably find some problems with it. You say, oh, the font is wrong, or the alignment's wrong, or that image looks weird. Then you go back into your help authoring tool, you fix it, and after you fixed it, then you regenerate it. So what I'm trying to convey here is that this is an iterative process, very much the same way as a help authoring tool. Okay, so now I'm going to share with you some of the guts of an ePUB file. I want to give you a quick tour of what it looks like once you open up an ePUB, so you have a sense of the key elements that we're going to be talking about. I'm going to switch over to here, and what I've done, I'll go here, is I generated an ePUB file called March 1st ePUB, and originally it had a suffix of .epub on it. All I did there was I switched the suffix to a zip file, and if you've ever done that, it's really easy. It'll say, you sure you want to do that? And I'll say, yes, I do. You do that, and then you basically decompress everything that's inside there. And after I've done that, what you find is this folder. So in the folder, inside an ePUB, there's typically 2 folders, 1 file, and I'm going to touch on some of the main elements inside this folder structure here. So the first thing I want to share with you is there's this MIME type file. You can open up any of these files in a notepad or a text editor. I'm going to use Notepad++. You open it, and what's inside there is just a little bit of code that was actually generated by the help authoring tool. And this is common across all the different ePUBs that you're going to create. It's part of the ePUB 3 spec. It's nice that the help authoring tool does this for you. I just want to show you that if you had multiple help files, multiple ePUBs, you can just reuse this file over and over if you needed to across projects. Because typically tech writers are not going to change this. This is part of the spec. But this is one of the things you're going to see inside there. Now back in here inside the meta.inf file, you can open this guy, and it also has a single file called the container.xml. Again, this is generated by the help authoring tool. You can click it, open it with your text editor. Unless you're changing the structure of your ePUB, this content, again, is pretty much going to stay the same across all your different projects, so you can reuse this if you want. There's a reference here to an OEBPS folder. Inside there is a file format called the content.opf. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So basically, unless you've changed the structure of your ePUB for some strange reason, you can reuse this content over and over. Okay, now what I'm going to show you is really where the action is, and that is in this folder called the OEBPS folder. and that stands, in case you're curious, for Open eBook Publication Structure. So you can open that guy, and then this is where, actually, as tech writers, most of the content will be of interest. So the first thing you need to, or you can look at, is your cascading style sheet. Again, this is generated by your help authoring tool. You can open it with a text editor, and inside here, if you've ever opened up a cascading style sheet, this is pretty standard stuff. So you have your different styles, and then the different attributes associated with each style. So in this case, we've got font size 12 point for paragraph, the heading is bold, and so on. So I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more in a few minutes, but I wanted just to introduce you that that's where you change that file. And then also there is a file called a TOC-NCX, and basically, as you might have guessed, this is your table of contents, again, generated by your help authoring tool. If you ever need to edit content in there, you have the table of contents, so you would have, this is the heading, understanding the application, and then this is the URL underneath, understanding the application.html, and so on. I don't really foresee you having to do a lot of changes in here, but if you know, it's nice to know that this exists and that you can change it if you are so inclined. Then the last thing I want to mention is there's a file called a content.opf file inside. And again, you can open that with a text editor. And basically what's inside here are a couple things. One is the so-called, what we call metadata. It basically gives you more background details about the ePUB. So for instance, we have inside here a title, and it explains the title or the name of the ePUB file. We have the person who created it, that would be me. We have the person or the publisher. In this case, this was the client that I was working for. And then the date that I actually created this ePUB file. Second section I want to mention is this manifest section. Basically, this is just a bunch of content that's made up inside the ePUB file. So if you add new content, such as an embedded font, you actually have to declare that in the manifest section. I'm going to be doing that in the next slide. We're going to be talking about how to embed fonts and why you would want to do it. And so that's a good segue to go back to our PowerPoint. So let's go back. Okay, so embedding fonts. Why would you do it and how to do it? So there's really a couple ways that you can add fonts to your application. One is embedding. The nice thing about embedding is if you want a lot of control about the fonts that you use, there is a way to do it. And that's basically by downloading fonts that you like to your ePUB file and then referencing it, and then it will show up. So this heading is understanding the application is using a embedded font that I tried, and it's called Quintessential. And I downloaded that from Google's font website, which I'm going to show you. So basically, why you embed fonts is it gives you a lot more control over fonts than you normally would have. But it does have its drawbacks, which I'll touch on. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the major steps on how you embed fonts. So the first step is you would go to a website such as Google Fonts, find a font that you like, and at the bottom here, I've taken a screenshot of Quintessential. So I like this one, so I'm going to download it. So the first step I need to do is click the button saying Add to my collection. I add it to my collection, and then the next step I need to do is actually download it. And the reason I need to download it is because if your users are going offline, if they're going to that remote cabin or going up to the airplane on an airplane ride, and they don't have network connectivity, you have to bundle your fonts with your ePUB. Otherwise, your fancy font is not going to show up in your ePUB. Okay, so that's an important step. So the next step is then after you say I'm going to download it, I've created a font folder inside of that OEBPS folder that I just mentioned. I created a font folder called fonts. and I'm going to group my fonts inside there. You don't have to do that. You can leave your fonts out scattered about, but I think it's, from a file management perspective, it would be nice to, especially if you have a bunch of these fonts, to put them all in one area. By the way, the latest spec of ePUB, that's version 3, supports both open type fonts and true type fonts. Okay, so we downloaded it now, and then the last, or near I guess the second to last step is you need to then go into your cascading style sheet, which I just showed you, and you need to declare the font up at the top. So this is a new font, so we say I'm going to, in my ePUB, add a new font called Quintessential. I've got a, inside my font face section. And the other important thing to mention here is you need to tell the CSS exactly where you're going to find it. So in this case, I'm downloading it to that fonts folder that I mentioned, and this Quintessential is a true type font, so it's got the suffix TTF. Last but not least for this slide is then I need to say, okay, for every heading 1 that I want to use, I want to use Quintessential, and so you declare it here, and then you can of course use it wherever you want. So you could have it in heading 2, heading 3, might be overkill, but you can do it. And then the last step here is I mentioned the manifest section. So I've highlighted this piece. Well, basically you need to add a blurb here saying, I want to add an embedded font. I'm going to find it in this folder called fonts, and it's called quintessentialregular.ttf, and it's a true type font. If you don't do this, it doesn't unfortunately work in eReader, so it's important that you add that step. Okay, so after you've done that, then you need to test it on your eReader software and make sure that it shows up as it appears. So as you could probably guess, there's some benefits to doing this. I mean, if you're, as I said, you've got a vision of how your document you want it to look, and you want to use specific fonts, this is a way to do it. The downside is I found it's very prone to error, so if you just make one little typo, your font is not going to show up. The other thing that I found is that if you do this and you try it on one e-reader, if you download this to one e-reader such as iBooks, it might work, and then if you download the same file to another e-reader package such as Adobe Digital Editions, it won't work. So my caveat here is that if you're going to do this, make sure you test it on all the different e-reader packages that you think your users are going to use. Otherwise, you may get an experience that you're not expecting. So that, as I said, is one way to deal with fonts. There's an easier way, thankfully. And so that is what I'm going to touch on quickly here, is that instead of actually embedding the fonts and going through that multiple step process, what you can do is in your cascading style sheet, this is similar to like a web page, you can have a paragraph style and then say inside the paragraph style, I'd like to use Verdana. If Verdana does not work, then I'd like to use Arial, and for some weird reason, if that's not on your PC, then just please use a sans serif font. So that's basically what that is saying. So it's not as controlling, but it gives you more flexibility, and chances are that users are going to have these fonts on there because they're pretty much pre-installed on most users' machines. So it doesn't give the level of control, but it makes our lives easier because this is, as you can see, a lot easier to do than the 3 or 4 steps that I just showed you before on the embedding fonts option. So here's an example of how this is going to work in reality. So the top part of this screen capture is showing a paragraph style for, say, some steps. And inside there we have font family, Verdana, Arial, sans serif. And then the bottom part of the screen capture is showing you how that might actually appear in an e-reader. So this is just like 2 views that kind of munged into one. But what I found anyway is that most tech writing, we don't go usually with the fancy fonts, but the standard fonts that you get on most PCs suffices. So actually, if I was going to go with one of these 2 options, I would say I'd maybe go with this option rather than the embedding of font. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about alignment of text. Alignment of text works as you pretty much would expect for most devices. So if you want to left align some content, on most e-readers it left aligns. This is an example of some content that shows up on an iPhone. I've taken another screenshot of the same image, but it's showing up on the iPad. And you may or may not know this, but this content, even though I've said I want it left aligned, it's actually showing up as fully justified. And that's actually kind of just a minor gotcha that you get with the iPad. Basically, Apple has set it up so that by default, it will show all content in an ePUB by default as justified. So if you are wanting the ability to go back to left aligned, basically there's a couple ways to do it, but the easy way to do it is maybe document it for your users to say what they would need to do is to go into their settings area on their iPad, go under apps. There's a section on the bottom that says iBooks. You click iBooks, and then on the right-hand side, you'll see this option at the top saying full justification. By default, that is on. So all users would have to do is flip that off, go back into their iBooks app, and then it will left align as you would expect. So a little surprising that the setting is not even in the iBooks app. You actually have to go into settings. Not obvious even why they fully justify things, but anyways, that's the way it is for now. So that's a workaround that you can use if you're wanting content to be moving over to the left or right or whatever. Okay, another thing that you can do after the fact in a CSS is using controlling page breaks. And you probably know within your help authoring tool you can control page breaks to a certain extent. This provides you with more control. So for instance, the first example here, we have a heading to, and what we can say in the cascading style sheet is that for every time we have a heading to, I always want there to be a page break before. So say you had like a new chapter, and you always wanted all your heading twos to break onto a new page. This is one way to deal with it. The second example, heading 3, page break before avoid. That's, if you don't want there to be a page break before heading 3s, this is one way to handle that. And then sort of in the same vein, if you have heading 3 page break after avoid, you don't want there to be page breaks after a heading 3. This is a way that you can accomplish that. All right. So I think maybe showing examples would make this clear, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So here's a little ePUB that I created. I agree, not the most beautiful thing, but basically what I was trying to do here is to create a weird page break. And so I did manage to do that. At the bottom we have testing page breaks on the left-hand side, sitting all by itself. And so what you could do is you could say, if this was a heading 3, say heading 3, I want to avoid any page breaks after that section. If you applied that in your CSS, then basically you're telling the e-reader software, if at all possible, try to avoid these breaks like this one shown here. Here's another example where we have a heading 2. It's sitting on the top of a page, and we could have put in the CSS here. For every heading 2, I want there to be a page break before. We can do that in the CSS, and then it will show up as something like this. So these controls are not just limited to headings. You can do other kind of cool things with them. For instance, if you have a long table, and you say it stands like just around the page, but you don't want it to break, you can say, I don't want there to be a page break inside the table. So you could say, you can do that by specifying the table and then saying page break inside avoid. So this would work for a shorter table or a shorter list. You can do that. However, if you've got like a 4-page table, of course this isn't going to work because the e-reader software has got to break the table somewhere. So you have to be kind of realistic about what you're expecting the e-reader to do. Same thing for lists. I guess the other thing that I would mention is, by adding these controls, try not to go too crazy on them, because from what I understand, you can basically create extra page breaks inside your documents if you've added page breaks everywhere. The other thing that I'd really mention is whenever you're doing this, make sure you test your content on your different e-reader packages, because you could get unexpected results. So you might have to do a bit of an iterative process on this to get it to the way you want it to look. Okay, so I'm also going to mention controlling widows and orphans. Within most of the e-readers, there is some control over this. So on the right-hand side, taking a screen capture from Adobe Digital Editions, I have this one procedure step where it's sitting by itself as a widow. A widow is basically a piece of content that is sitting at the top of a page by itself. And what you can do is you can actually say in the CSS, hey, I want to basically reduce this kind of thing. So if I'm going to have a widow, I want there to be at least 2 lines to show up at the top of the page. Or if you prefer, you can make it 3 lines or 4 lines or whatever. It's flexible that way. So you can have, you can specify that, and you can also do the same thing for orphans. So an orphan is a piece of content that's showing up marooned at the bottom of a page. You can do the same thing where you say, for say a procedure, I don't want it to have 1 word sitting there by itself, and so you can say I want there to be 2 or 3 or 5 lines, whatever you'd like. One caveat about this, and there's always caveats, isn't there, is that this does not work on the iBooks app. So it works across some of the other e-readers, but not iBooks currently. Not to say that Apple isn't going to change this, and maybe in 2 months from now they will fix it, but as we speak, it's not available. All right, so take a big breath. We talked about a lot of things here in a fairly short amount of time. I thought I'd summarize what I just talked about. So here we have fonts, whether it's embedding fonts or using a suggested list of different fonts. It's supported across the different types of e-readers. Alignment does work on different e-readers except for on the iPad, where you have to override it from fully justified. Page breaks do work across the different e-reader packages. Widows and orphans do work. Unfortunately, they do not work on the iPad and iPhone, as I just mentioned. So that's something to be aware of. So that's basically what I summarized there. I thought I'd show you also just an example of an ePUB file. I have actually some technical communications on there just to see what it looks like. So these are just a few screen captures from Windows 8 manual from O'Reilly, the publisher. So they have a table of contents. It doesn't expand and collapse like you have with a traditional help system. That's one difference. There's a little bit of conceptual material, some procedures. You can include tips like you have at the bottom there. You can have graphics. We have a graphic at the top. And also this screenshot is showing you that there's other things that are inside ePUB that are not obvious. One of them is that it has a search mechanism. So if you click the magnifying glass up at the top, you can search for any word inside the ePUB, and it will bring results back. The icon just to the right is a bookmark. So if people are reading, up to a certain part, they can bookmark that page, and then the rest you can change your font, so you can change the size. So there's a number of things there that are not obvious, but they could be helpful for technical communications as well. Okay, just another piece that I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't mention was that you really, after you make all these changes, and especially if you're changing your CSS, you really should validate your ePUB. If you don't validate it, there's a chance that it may not present or display properly. There's a couple of ways to do that. There's the Google's link there, And basically, you can use this for larger EPUBs, and it will validate it and double check that your EPUB is conforms to the ePUB 3 spec. The second link is for shorter EPUBs. It's actually being maintained by the IBPF. It stands for the International Digital Publishing Forum. And those are the folks that actually write the ePUB 3 spec. There's also in some of the newer help authoring tools a validator built right in. So you can validate your content before you're even finished, so you make sure it conforms. So there's a variety of ways that you can do this, and so just definitely a worthwhile step when you're looking at changing EPUBs. The other thing that I wanted to mention is previewing EPUBs. So when I started on this journey, it wasn't obvious to me how I even get an EPUB file over to an iPad. It wouldn't be that difficult, but actually there's probably 10 steps involved. So you need to sync your iPad to your PC, get iTunes involved, sync the content, and then open the content in iBooks. And so rather than going through all those steps, what I've done here is added a URL, and I blogged about this about almost a year ago, I guess. And so I have all the steps about what you need to do to get content over to an EPUB. I'll leave that up for a minute. I know that everyone should also be getting the slide deck, so we can always look at this at a later point. All right, so what I'm going to do now is talk about just some other resources that you can use if you're wanting to know more about EPUBs. One book that actually I found indispensable on the subject was Elizabeth Castro's book, ePUB Straight to the Point. It's a few years old now, and so like anything that's technology related, I'm sure it was accurate at the time, but there's been new versions of software that have been released, and so some of the content is not up to date, but luckily she has a website called, weirdly enough, Pigs, Gourds, and Wikis, and in there she's got a lot of updates to the book. Lynda.com has a few online demos, movies about ePUB files, and so I would recommend, if you're a member, to definitely check those out. There's a website, ePUB Secrets. They have some details about creating ePUBs. And then there's another good resource at this blog about how to embed fonts in ePUB files. So if you're wanting another person's take on embedding fonts, you want to go down that road, there's some step-by-step procedures there on how to do that. And then finally, there's some contact information here from me. There is a LinkedIn URL there. From time to time, I do post content about technical communications issues on my Twitter feed there. I have a website, and if you have questions after this presentation, about the presentation, about ePUBs and so on, you can reach me at that email address. So I think that's it for my presentation, and I guess if anyone now has any questions, I can do my best to answer them.
Awesome. We definitely have a few questions, Robert. Thank you so much. Before we get to that, would you mind forwarding to the next slide real quick?
Yeah, so the trick here is that this next slide that I created for you was in a PDF, not in the original.
Ah.
So I don't have a handy slide that I appended for you.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, so the slides I sent you, not so much? All right. So, okay. No problem. I did want to mention the coupon code. This is very important. The coupon code is SEP100. That is SEP as in September. I'm going to go ahead and type that in right now. SEP100. You can see that in the chat box right there. SEP100 is your coupon code to save $100 off of Madcap software training. And we actually happen to have a writing and publishing for mobile and ePUB class, and you can even save $100 on that if you're getting ready to deploy to mobile. This is going to cover mobile overview, writing for mobile devices, style sheets, text and lists, images and video, tables, links and navigation, page layout and design, web help mobile skins, building and publishing, testing, a bunch of resources as well. It's a hands-on one-day on-site or two-day web-based training course. And a certified Flare instructor is going to cover mobile and ePUB topics. Everything you need to know about Flare and ePUB. So again, that coupon code is in your chat window. It is SEP100. And please go ahead and get in touch with sales@madcapsoftware.com, and we'll be happy to provide you with that discount for any of our training. Also want to mention that we have Mad World coming up next April. If you've never been to Mad World, well, we only did it once, and you've probably heard about how awesome it is. And we invite you to come out and join us for Mad World again. And you can get all the details at madcapsoftware.com. So let's go ahead and get into the questions. We have one from Dawn. Robert, she wants to know, when would a user use an ePUB file, say in a software environment, and why?
Right. So I would say that, an obvious example would be that if your users are using content on an iPad, for instance, the clients that I'm currently working for, they have some apps that they have that they're using, and they wanted some assisted documentation that go along with those apps. And we knew that people were using content such as on an iPad. Then we knew that the audience wasn't very technically savvy, so I created some custom documentation that they could open in, say, an iBooks environment, and then read the content that was specific for them. So that's an example. Basically, if your users are going to be doing any sort of scenario where they're going to be using content on an iPhone, on an Android device, or iPad, doing documentation for those kind of scenarios probably is definitely worth exploring and seeing if ePUB is the best solution.
Okay, Patrick would like to know, do most e-readers include access to the table of contents from a menu?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag there, and they all handle it a bit differently. So iPad, you saw some screen captures that I took for iBooks there, so there is definitely a table of content there. I noticed Adobe Digital Editions, they have content on the left-hand side. I can't remember which package it is, but I do think there is one where it actually always shows up, the table of content. Someone just showed me that recently. So they all handle it differently, and they all, I think, do support it, but they have their own quirks about how they're going to display it.
Okay, Patrick also wants to know, how do different e-readers affect the style sheet to control the format of an ePUB document? For example, my Kobo allows me to change the font of different books that I'm reading. Are users able to overwrite whatever formatting that we apply with their own selections?
So yes, to some extent. So for instance, in the iPad, iBooks there, basically users can change, say, the font size. So they can change that. I believe they can also change the font, so they can override that. I don't think it writes it to the CSS, but it's like a temporary override.
Okay. Let's see here. Laura wants to know, how does ePUB format automatically adjust for differences in size between tablet and smartphone? Did we lose you, Robert? And we appear to have lost Robert. It's quite all right. I tell you what, we're going to get to the rest of these questions via email. If you did ask a question that we were unable to get to, it's fine. We're going to shoot out an email with the answer to that question, so keep an eye on your inbox. And also, you're going to be getting the slide deck for this presentation, as well as a recording of this presentation, too. So thank you again for joining us. I also want to remind you of the coupon code SEP100. It is right there in your chat window, along with a link if you want to check out our MadCap ePUB and mobile training. That coupon code is good for $100 off of that or any of our other classes. And you can even learn all about ePUB output in MadCap Flare. I provided that link right above the link to training. So, Robert, did we still lose your audio? Yep, your audio is gone. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Robert. If you can still hear me, I'm getting a lot of great comments about your excellent presentation. And thank you all for joining us on behalf of Madcap Software.